Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from believing you're too broken to be loved. Sometimes the heaviest burden isn't what we carry, but what we think we deserve. Elias Boone walked into the Candlelight Tavern, wanting nothing more than a quiet meal. Charlotte Hale sat at her usual table, tired of pitying glances and careful whispers. A simple mix-up put the weathered mountain man across from the rancher's daughter in her wheelchair. He'd spent 30 years avoiding people. She'd spent 3 years watching them avoid her. But that evening something unexpected happened. Two people who thought they were too damaged for friendship found themselves talking like old companions. He saw past her chair. She saw past his guilt. What neither expected was how two wounded hearts might heal each other. Could a chance meeting change everything they believed about themselves? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through the streets of Cedar Ridge, a town that had grown prosperous from the cattle trade and the silver mines that dotted the surrounding mountains. Gas lamps flickered to life as evening settled over the wooden boardwalks, casting warm pools of light that beckoned travelers and locals alike. The Candlelight Tavern stood at the heart of it all, its windows glowing like amber jewels against the darkening sky. Inside, the tavern hummed with the comfortable murmur of familiar voices. Ranchers discussed cattle prices over steaming bowls of stew, while merchants counted their day's earnings and planned tomorrow's ventures. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted beef, fresh bread, and the subtle fragrance of beeswax candles that gave the establishment its name. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, sending dancing reflections across polished mahogany tables, each one carefully arranged with crisp white linens and silver cutlery. At table 7, positioned near the large front window, where she could watch the comings and goings of the town, Charlotte Hale sat with the practiced elegance that had been drilled into her since childhood. Her wheat-colored hair was arranged in a simple but refined style, and her emerald dress, tailored to accommodate her seated position, spoke of quality without ostentation. The brass fittings of her wheelchair gleamed in the candlelight, as meticulously maintained as everything else in her ordered world. She possessed what the townspeople called breeding, that indefinable quality that came from generations of careful education, proper comportment, and the kind of confidence that money could nurture but not buy. Her father, Theodore Hale, owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, employing over 200 men and controlling grazing rights across thousands of acres. The Hale name carried weight in Cedar Ridge, and Charlotte had grown up understanding both the privileges and the burdens that came with it. But tonight, as on every Thursday evening for the past 3 years, she dined alone. Not because she lacked invitations. Half the eligible men in the territory would have counted themselves fortunate to escort her, but because she had grown weary of the careful conversations, the studied avoidance of certain topics, and the way people's eyes would dart nervously between her face and her chair before settling somewhere safely neutral. The accident had changed everything, though not in the ways people assumed. The physical limitations were real enough. She would never again race her chestnut mare across the open meadows or dance at the harvest celebrations. But what struck deeper was how it had revealed the true nature of her relationships. Friends became visitors who spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones. Suitors transformed into awkward young men who spoke to her father about her condition, as if she had become a delicate flower to be discussed rather than a woman to be courted. Charlotte had adapted, as she always did. She had learned to navigate social situations with grace, to deflect pity with wit, and to maintain her dignity in a world that seemed determined to define her by what she could no longer do, rather than what she remained capable of. Her Thursday dinners at the candlelight had become a small rebellion, a declaration that she would not hide away in the family mansion, would not become the tragic figure that others seemed to expect. The reservation card that lay beside her plate bore her name in the careful script of the tavern's hostess. Table 7, her usual spot, reserved every Thursday at 7 o'clock. It had become as much a part of the tavern's routine as lighting the candles or polishing the glasses. Charlotte Hale's table, where she sat with quiet dignity, reading correspondence or simply watching the life of the town unfold beyond the window. Miles away, high in the pine-covered slopes of Copper Mountain, Elias Boone was preparing for what had become a rare journey into civilization. His cabin, built by his own hands from logs he had felled and stones he had gathered from the mountain streams, sat in a clearing that offered a commanding view of the valley below. It was a simple structure, sturdy and weatherproof, with a stone fireplace that had warmed him through 15 winters of solitude. Elias was a man shaped by the mountains, his body lean and strong from years of physical labor, his hands scarred from working with tools and stone and the endless tasks of mountain living. His hair, once sandy brown, had turned silver at the temples, and his face bore the deep lines that came from squinting into mountain wind and sun. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to depend entirely on himself, every gesture purposeful, every action considered. The guilt that had driven him to these heights 30 years ago had settled into his bones like winter cold, becoming so much a part of him that he barely noticed its weight anymore. But it was there, constant as the mountain peaks that surrounded his refuge, shaping his days and haunting his nights. He had built his life around avoiding the very thing that awaited him in Cedar Ridge, human connection, with all its possibilities for joy and its certainties of pain. Tonight's journey had become necessary because his supplies were running low, and winter was approaching faster than usual. The first snows had already dusted the highest peaks, and he needed provisions that would carry him through the months of isolation ahead. He had delayed the trip as long as possible, but mountain winters showed no mercy to the unprepared. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Tracker, stood patiently while Elias secured his saddlebags and checked his gear one final time. The animal had been his companion for 8 years, as comfortable with the mountain trails as Elias himself. Together, they had traveled these paths in all seasons, carrying supplies up from the valley towns and ensuring that Elias could maintain his chosen exile. The ride down would take most of the day, following switchback trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine, past rushing streams that would soon be locked under ice, and over ridges that offered breathtaking views of the territory below. It was beautiful country, the kind that could fill a man's soul or drive him to madness, depending on his temperament and his reasons for being there. As he mounted Tracker and began the descent, Elias carried with him the accumulated weight of 3 decades of self-imposed isolation. He had learned to find peace in solitude, to take comfort in the rhythm of seasons and the reliable companionship of the mountain wildlife. But there were times, particularly as winter approached, when the silence felt less like peace and more like punishment. Back in Cedar Ridge, the evening proceeded according to its established patterns. The Candlelight Tavern filled with its usual Thursday crowd, the conversation flowing as freely as the wine and whiskey. Charlotte finished her correspondence, letters to distant cousins, business matters related to her father's ranch, and a brief note to a former schoolmate who had married and moved to San Francisco. She had developed the habit of extending these meals, not from any particular love of the food, though the tavern's kitchen was excellent, but because the alternative was returning to the mansion where her father would be waiting, with his careful questions and his barely concealed worry. Theodore Hale loved his daughter deeply, but his love had become something heavy and protective. Like a blanket that warmed but also smothered, the mansion itself, built to showcase the Hale family's success, had become a sort of beautiful prison. Its wide hallways and spacious rooms were perfectly suited to a wheelchair, modified after the accident with ramps and other accommodations that spoke of both wealth and thoughtfulness. But it was also isolated, set apart from the town by carefully manicured grounds and a long, curved driveway that seemed designed to keep the world at a comfortable distance. Charlotte's mother had died when she was 12, leaving behind a daughter who had inherited her strength of will, and her father, who channeled his grief into an almost obsessive protection of his remaining family. The accident had intensified his protective instincts to the point where Charlotte sometimes felt more like a treasured artifact than a living woman. As she sat in the familiar warmth of the tavern, watching the interplay of light and shadow on the street outside, Charlotte reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 3 years ago, she had been the acknowledged belle of Cedar Ridge society, courted by ambitious young men and expected to make a brilliant marriage that would unite two powerful families and secure her future. The accident had not only changed her physical circumstances, but had stripped away the comfortable assumptions about what her life would become. In some ways, she reflected, it had been a liberation as much as a tragedy. The expectations that had once seemed so important, the careful choreography of courtship, the endless rounds of social obligations, the pressure to marry well and quickly, had evaporated in an instant. What remained was the question of what kind of life she would build from the pieces that remained, and whether she had the courage to build something authentic rather than merely acceptable. The reservation card beside her plate caught the candlelight, its simple presence representing both the routine that had become her refuge and the boundaries that had begun to feel like limitations. Every Thursday at table 7, Charlotte Hale dining alone while the world moved around her. It was predictable, safe, and increasingly empty of any real meaning. Outside, the first hints of autumn frost were beginning to appear on the windows of the shops that lined the main street. Soon the mountain passes would become treacherous, and the town would settle into its winter rhythms, shorter days, longer nights, and the kind of introspective quiet that could either foster growth or breed despair. Neither Charlotte nor Elias knew, as the evening unfolded according to its familiar patterns, that a simple mistake was about to alter the careful architecture of their separate solitudes. The reservation card that seemed so permanent, so representative of unchanging routine, was about to become the instrument of an unexpected transformation. The sun had set behind the western mountains by the time Elias guided Tracker down the final switchback into Cedar Ridge. The soon journey had taken longer than expected. A washout on the upper trail had forced a detour that added 2 hours to the descent, and his body ached from the long ride. Dust clung to his clothes and settled in the lines of his weathered face, marking him as clearly as any brand as a man from the high country. Cedar Ridge looked different in the evening light than it did during his infrequent daytime visits. The gas lamps created pools of warmth along the boardwalks, and through the windows of homes and businesses he could see the golden glow of family dinners and comfortable conversations. It was a reminder of the life he had chosen to leave behind, and it stirred feelings he had spent years learning to suppress. He stabled Tracker at Murphy's livery, paying for feed and a warm stall, then shouldered his saddlebags and made his way down Main Street. His original plan had been to purchase supplies, find a room at the boarding house, and return to the mountain at first light. But the long ride and the prospect of sleeping on a real mattress instead of his simple mountain bunk made the idea of a hot meal at the Candlelight Tavern suddenly appealing. The tavern's warmth enveloped him as he pushed through the heavy oak doors. The contrast with the cool mountain air was immediate and welcome, as was the rich aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread. He paused inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the candlelight and surveying the dining room with the instinctive caution of a man who had learned to assess his surroundings before committing to them. Most of the tables were occupied by the kind of well-dressed locals he remembered from his previous visits to town, ranchers, merchants, and their families enjoying the tavern's reputation for excellent food and refined atmosphere. Elias was acutely aware of how he must appear to them, trail-worn, dust-covered, his simple clothes marking him as an outsider in this bastion of civilized comfort. "Evening, sir," The hostess greeted him with professional politeness, though her eyes took in his appearance with barely concealed assessment. "Will you be dining alone this evening?" "Yes, ma'am," Elias replied, his voice roughened by the mountain air and months of disuse. "Just looking for a quiet table and a hot meal." She consulted the reservation book on her podium, running her finger down the list of names and table assignments. "Let me see what we have available." Her finger paused at an entry, and she looked up with a slight frown. "I'm afraid we're quite busy tonight. Most of our tables are reserved or occupied." Elias was about to suggest that he could wait or perhaps take his business elsewhere when the hostess's expression brightened. "Actually, I believe table 7 might work. The reservation seems to be running late, and we could seat you there temporarily." She led him across the dining room, past tables where conversations paused momentarily as curious glances followed his progress. Elias felt the familiar weight of being observed, judged, found somehow wanting by people whose lives had never been touched by the kind of tragedy that had driven him to the mountains. But he followed the hostess with quiet dignity, his shoulders straight and his gaze steady. "Here we are," she said, stopping beside a table near the front window where a young woman in an emerald dress sat reading a letter. "I'm so sorry, Miss Hale, but there seems to have been a mix-up with our reservations this evening. Would you mind terribly sharing your table? It will just be for a short while until we can sort things out." Charlotte looked up from her correspondence, and for a moment Elias found himself meeting the clearest grey eyes he had ever seen. There was intelligence there and strength and something else, a kind of recognition that surprised him. She took in his dusty clothes and weathered appearance without the reflexive judgment he had expected, her gaze settling on his face with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than calculation. "Of course," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of good breeding, but without the affected accent that often accompanied such speech. "Please sit down." "I'm Charlotte Hale, Elias Boone," he replied, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of a man who had learned to be conscious of his impact on his surroundings. "I appreciate your hospitality, Miss Hale. I can find another place if this is inconvenient." "It's not inconvenient at all," Charlotte said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it. "I was just catching up on correspondence. Company would actually be welcome." The hostess retreated with obvious relief, leaving them alone at the table with its crisp white cloth and gleaming silverware. For a moment, neither spoke, and Elias found himself studying the woman across from him with an attention that surprised him. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was not the kind of obvious beauty that demanded immediate notice. Instead, there was something subtle and compelling about her features, the determined set of her jaw, the way her grey eyes seemed to take in everything while revealing little, the careful grace with which she folded her letter and set it aside. It was only then that he noticed the wheelchair, positioned so naturally at the table that it had taken several moments for him to register its presence. The realization brought with it a complex mixture of emotions, recognition, understanding, and something deeper that he was not ready to examine too closely. "You're from the mountains," Charlotte observed, and it was not a question. "I can tell by the way you hold yourself. Mountain men have a different bearing than valley folk." "Yes, ma'am," Elias confirmed. "Been up on Copper Mountain for quite a few years now." "Alone?" The simple question carried no judgment, no pity, just curiosity. But it touched something in Elias that had been carefully protected for decades. "Alone," he confirmed. Charlotte nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I understand the appeal of solitude. Sometimes it's the only way to find peace." There was something in her voice that suggested personal experience with the subject, and Elias found himself looking at her with new attention. Most people, when they learned about his mountain isolation, reacted with either incomprehension or a kind of romantic fascination with the idea of wilderness living. Charlotte's response suggested a more complex understanding. The server arrived to take their orders, breaking the moment of connection but not dispelling it entirely. Charlotte ordered the evening's fish special with practiced ease, while Elias, suddenly conscious of his dusty appearance and uncertain social graces. Asked for the beef stew and bread. The stew is excellent here, Charlotte commented after the server had departed. The kitchen sources their beef from local ranchers who understand proper aging. You've made a good choice. I don't get to town often enough to develop strong opinions about the food, Elias admitted. Most of my meals come from what I can hunt, fish, or grow myself. That must require considerable skill, Charlotte said, and again there was no condescension in her voice, just genuine interest. I imagine the mountain seasons make growing anything challenging. It does take some planning, Elias agreed, finding himself surprisingly comfortable with the conversation. Short growing season, early frosts, soil that needs considerable work before it will support much beyond wild growth. But there's satisfaction in providing for yourself, in knowing you can survive without depending on others. Independence, Charlotte mused. Yes, I can understand the value of that. The way she said it suggested layers of meaning that Elias was not sure he should probe. But before he could decide whether to pursue the subject, their meals arrived. The simple act of sharing a table, of eating in companionable silence, broken by occasional observations about the food or the weather, felt remarkably natural given how much Elias had grown accustomed to solitude. Do you ever miss it? Charlotte asked as they neared the end of their meal. The company of other people? It was a question that cut closer to the bone than Elias was prepared for, touching on thoughts he had worked hard to avoid examining. Sometimes, he said carefully, but missing something and being able to have it are different things. Charlotte's grey eyes studied his face with an intensity that made him feel as though she were reading something written there in a language he was not aware he spoke. Yes, she said quietly. They certainly are. The reservation card that had brought them together still lay beside Charlotte's plate, forgotten now in the surprising ease of their conversation. What had begun as a simple mistake, a mix-up in the hostess's careful system, had become something neither of them had expected. A moment of genuine human connection between two people who had learned to live without such things. The walk back to the boarding house should have been straightforward, but Elias found his thoughts returning again and again to the unexpected conversation at the Candlelight Tavern. There had been something in Charlotte Hale's manner, a directness, an absence of the careful social calculations he remembered from his younger days, that had caught him off guard. Most people, when they spoke to him at all, seemed to be working through some internal script about how one should interact with a mountain hermit. Charlotte had simply talked to him as though he were a person worth talking to. The boarding house. Room was clean and sparse, furnished with the basics necessary for travelers. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair positioned near the window that looked out onto Main Street. Elias set his saddlebags on the chair and moved to the window, watching the last few stragglers make their way home through the pools of lamplight. Cedar Ridge settled into its evening quiet, the kind of peaceful domesticity he had once taken for granted and now observed like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that carried him back to mountain ledges and falling rocks, to his brother's voice, calling his name with increasing desperation, to the moment when everything that had seemed solid and reliable in his world had given way. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a town beginning its day. The clatter of wagon wheels on wooden streets, the distant lowing of cattle, the cheerful calls of early risers greeting each other with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. By full daylight, he was dressed and ready to begin the business that had brought him to town. The general store was his first stop, where he moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, selecting the supplies that would see him through another mountain winter. Flour, salt, coffee, sugar, canned goods that would supplement his hunting, and the preserved meat that already filled his larder. The storekeeper, a middle-aged man named Henderson, tallied his purchases with professional courtesy while making the kind of small talk that seemed obligatory in such transactions. "I haven't seen you in town for quite a while, Mr. Boone," Henderson observed, as he wrapped Elias's purchases in brown paper. "How are things up on the mountain?" "Quiet," Elias replied, which was both accurate and sufficient to discourage further inquiry. "Well, winter's coming early this year by all accounts," Henderson continued, apparently undeterred by Elias's brevity. "Old-timers are saying it's going to be a hard one. You might want to consider stocking up extra just in case." Elias nodded. His thanks for the advice and completed his business, loading his supplies into the saddlebags with the careful distribution that would balance the load for Tracker's climb back to the high country. But as he prepared to leave Cedar Ridge behind for another season, he found himself walking past the Candlelight Tavern, slowing his pace as he drew near the large front window where Charlotte had sat the evening before. The table was empty now. Of course, it was barely past breakfast time, and the tavern would not begin serving its dinner guests for hours yet. But the sight of that familiar spot near the window stirred something in him that he was reluctant to examine too closely. It had been a long time since he had enjoyed a conversation with another person, longer still since he had spoken with someone who seemed to understand the attraction of solitude without romanticizing or pitying it. Charlotte, meanwhile, was dealing with her own unexpected reactions to the previous evening's encounter. She had returned to the Hale mansion to find her father waiting in the library, his evening reading abandoned in favor of the kind of restless pacing that indicated serious preoccupation. "How was dinner, my dear?" Theodore Hale asked, settling into his accustomed chair as Charlotte positioned her wheelchair near the fireplace, where a low fire provided both warmth and the comfortable illusion of domestic tranquility. "Interesting," Charlotte replied, choosing her words with the care that had become second nature in conversations with her father. "I shared a table with a gentleman from the mountains, Elias Boone. Do you know the name?" Theodore's expression grew thoughtful. "Boone. Yes, I believe I remember something about that family. Tragedy of some sort, years ago. Mining accident, I think, or perhaps a climbing mishap. One of the brothers died, if I recall correctly. The other one disappeared into the high country afterward. That must be your dinner companion." Charlotte filed this information away with the mental note to pursue it further when an opportunity presented itself. Her father's memory for local history was encyclopedic, particularly when it involved families of any social or economic significance. If there was more to Elias Boone's story, Theodore would likely know it or be able to discover it through his extensive network of business and social connections. "He seemed quite knowledgeable about mountain living," Charlotte said carefully, "self-sufficient in a way that's rather admirable." Theodore's eyes sharpened with the kind of paternal attention that Charlotte had learned to navigate with considerable skill. "I hope you weren't subjected to any inappropriate attention, my dear. Some of these mountain men can be, well, they've been away from civilized company for extended periods." "He was perfectly respectful," Charlotte assured him, which was true. "Enough, though it failed to capture the complexity of their brief interaction. In fact, he seemed more comfortable with silence than with conversation, rather the opposite of inappropriately forward." This seemed to satisfy Theodore's immediate concerns, and the conversation moved on to other topics: ranch business, social obligations, the approaching winter season that would limit travel and concentrate Cedar Ridge society into its more intimate winter patterns. But even as Charlotte participated in these familiar discussions, part of her attention remained focused on her memories of the previous evening. There had been something in Elias Boone's manner that had reminded her of her own relationship with solitude. Not the enforced isolation that had followed her accident, but a chosen separation that served some deeper purpose. She had seen it in the way he held himself, in the careful attention he paid to his surroundings, in the economy of his speech, that suggested a man who had learned to be sparing with words because he so rarely had occasion to use them. The next morning brought a letter that would change the comfortable rhythm of Charlotte's days. It arrived with the regular post, delivered by young Timothy Walsh, who served as Cedar Ridge's postal clerk and whose mother had been Charlotte's governess years before. The letter bore the seal of Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had attended Charlotte during her recovery and who continued to monitor her health with the thoroughness that characterized his approach to medicine. Charlotte opened the letter. In the privacy of her sitting room, a space that had been carefully designed to accommodate her wheelchair while maintaining the elegance that was such an important part of the Hale family's public identity. Dr. Whitfield's handwriting was as precise as his medical practice, his words chosen with the care of a man who understood the weight that written diagnoses could carry. The letter contained an invitation that was both surprising and troubling. A colleague of Dr. Whitfield's, a specialist from Denver who had developed new techniques for treating spinal injuries, would be visiting Cedar Ridge in 2 weeks' time. Would Charlotte be willing to submit to an examination? The letter suggested new procedures that might offer possibilities that had not existed at the time of her accident. Charlotte read the letter twice, then set it aside and moved to the window that looked out over the grounds of the Hale estate. The possibility of medical intervention, of potential improvement in her condition, should have been cause for excitement or at least cautious hope. Instead, she found herself feeling a complex mixture of emotions that included as much trepidation as anticipation. The freedom was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. It also, she realized, with a mixture of surprise and self-awareness, created possibilities that had not existed before. Possibilities that might include returning to the Candlelight Tavern before her usual Thursday appointment, perhaps to continue a conversation that had been interrupted by the simple circumstance of it being time to leave. After a brief negotiation, Theodore agreed to leave her in the capable hands of Mrs. Patterson and the household staff, with the understanding that she would send word immediately if any problems arose. As Charlotte watched him ride away with the crew, she felt an unexpected surge of anticipation. For the first time in years, she would have complete control over her own schedule, her own choices, her own time. "Father," Charlotte said with the gentle firmness that had proven effective in managing his protective instincts, "I'm 24 years old, not 14. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs for a few days. Besides, you'll need to focus entirely on the fence repairs without worrying about social proprieties." Theodore nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "Perhaps I should ask your Aunt Margaret to come stay with you while I'm away. It doesn't seem appropriate for you to be alone in the house for such an extended period." "I'll manage the household affairs while you're gone," Charlotte assured him. "Mrs. Patterson can handle the domestic arrangements, and I can deal with any business correspondence that requires attention." The prospect of several days alone in the mansion was both liberating and unsettling. Charlotte had grown accustomed to her father's protective presence, even when it sometimes felt suffocating. His absence would create an unusual degree of freedom, but it would also remove the comfortable structure that his routines provided. "Most of the crew," Theodore replied. "Which means I'll be away from the house for several days, possibly longer if we run into complications." "How many men will you need?" she asked, automatically shifting into the practical mode that had made her an invaluable partner in ranch management, despite her physical limitations. Charlotte understood the implications immediately. Fence repairs in autumn required careful timing and considerable manpower, particularly when they involved moving cattle across territory that bordered neighboring ranches. The Hale operation prided itself on maintaining good relationships with its neighbors, which meant that any boundary issues needed to be resolved quickly and diplomatically. 20 minutes later, Theodore appeared in her office doorway with the expression that indicated serious business requiring immediate attention. "We've lost a section of fence in the north pasture," he announced without preamble. "Storm damage from last week finally gave way completely. We need to move the herd before they wander into Patterson's territory and create a boundary dispute." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the window, where she could see her father's foreman, James Morrison, riding up the circular drive with the urgency that typically accompanied ranch emergencies. Charlotte positioned her wheelchair near the window to observe the brief conference that took place on the front steps, reading the body language of crisis management that had become familiar over the years of managing a large cattle operation. Her morning had begun with the customary ritual of correspondence and estate business, conducted from the small office her father had arranged for her in the mansion's east wing. The room was designed for functionality, with a desk positioned at the proper height for wheelchair access and shelves arranged within easy reach. But today, the familiar tasks felt confining rather than purposeful, as though the careful order of her life had suddenly revealed itself to be a kind of beautiful cage. Charlotte, meanwhile, was struggling with her own unexpected complications. Dr. Whitfield's letter had created a disturbance in the careful equilibrium she had worked so hard to achieve. But it was not the only source of unsettlement in her thoughts. The brief encounter with Elias Boone had lingered in her mind with surprising persistence, coloring her usual routines with a restlessness she had not experienced in years. The revelation that Charlotte maintained a regular dining schedule created an unexpected dilemma. Today was Friday, which meant that if he wanted to see her again, he would need to remain in Cedar Ridge for nearly a week. The prospect should have been unthinkable. He had never stayed in town for more than 2 nights, and the approaching winter made every day of preparation crucial for mountain survival. Yet he found himself seriously considering the possibility. "Thursday evenings," Elias repeated. "Thank you." Something in his tone must have conveyed sincerity rather than presumption, because the hostess's expression softened slightly. "Miss Hale typically dines with us on Thursday evenings," she said carefully. "Table 7 at 7 o'clock. "It's been her custom for some time now." Elias nodded, recognizing the rebuff for what it was and respecting the woman's loyalty to her regular customers. "Of course, I meant no impropriety. I simply enjoyed our conversation and wondered if I might have the opportunity to speak with her again before I returned to the mountains." The hostess's expression grew carefully neutral, the practiced discretion of someone who served a clientele that valued privacy. "Miss Hale is one of our regular guests," she said, "but I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to discuss her habits with someone who isn't family." "Actually," Elias said, surprising himself with the words even as he spoke them, "I was wondering about Miss Hale, the young lady I shared a table with last evening. Does she dine here regularly?" "Mr. Boone, isn't it?" she said with professional recognition. "Are you looking to dine with us again today?" The tavern was nearly empty at mid-morning, hosting only a few businessmen conducting quiet conversations over coffee and the kind of pastries that Cedar Ridge society considered essential to civilized discourse. Charlotte was not there, of course. He had not really expected her to be, but the hostess from the previous evening was arranging flowers near the entrance, and she looked up as he approached. The decision, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity. Instead of mounting tracker and heading for the mountain trail, he found himself walking back toward the center of town, toward the Candlelight Tavern, where the morning sunlight streamed through the large front windows. He told himself he was simply curious, that after so many years of isolation, he was entitled to a moment's interest in the lives of others. But the excuse felt thin, even to his own critical assessment. But something about Charlotte Hale had disrupted the careful architecture of his detachment. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at him without pity or judgment, or the quiet understanding in her voice when she spoke about solitude. More likely, it was the recognition of something familiar in her manner, the careful control of someone who had learned to build walls around pain. The dignity of someone who refused to be defined by others' assumptions about what her life should become. The source of his hesitation troubled him more than he cared to admit. In 30 years of mountain living, he had established routines that served him well. Periodic trips to town for supplies, brief and efficient interactions with the merchants who provided what he could not make or grow himself, and prompt returns to the high country where he belonged. He had never lingered, never found himself curious about the lives of the townspeople, never wondered what might happen if he extended his stay. Elias should have been halfway up the mountain by now. The supplies were loaded, Tracker was rested and ready for the climb, and the weather promised to hold clear for at least another day. Everything pointed toward departure, toward the return to his mountain sanctuary, where the approaching winter would wrap him in its familiar isolation. Yet he found himself standing outside the general store, reluctant to begin the journey that had seemed so straightforward just 24 hours earlier. By Saturday afternoon, Elias had convinced himself that remaining in Cedar Ridge was a practical decision, rather than an emotional one. The weather had turned unseasonably warm, creating ideal conditions for the kind of maintenance work on his cabin that was best accomplished before winter's arrival. He could use the time to purchase additional supplies, perhaps some of the specialized tools that were available in town, but impossible to obtain in the mountains. The reasoning was sound, even if it failed to explain why he found himself walking past the Candlelight Tavern twice daily, or why he had chosen to extend his stay at the boarding house rather than camping outside town as he had on previous visits. The truth, which he was not yet ready to acknowledge fully, was that something had awakened in him during that brief conversation with Charlotte Hale. Not romantic interest. Exactly. He was too honest with himself to pretend that his feelings were so simple or immediate, but rather a recognition that he had been living only half a life for the past 30 years. The mountain solitude that had once provided refuge from pain had gradually transformed into a different kind of prison, one built not of stone and iron, but of habit and fear. On Sunday morning, he found himself walking past the small church where most of Cedar Ridge's respectable citizens gathered for weekly worship. Through the open doors, he could hear the familiar cadences of hymns and prayers that had once been a regular part of his own life, back when he had lived in the world instead of merely visiting it periodically for supplies. The music stirred memories he had worked hard to bury: Sunday dinners with extended family, community gatherings that celebrated harvest and holiday, the comfortable rhythms of a life embedded in human connection. He was about to continue his walk when he noticed a familiar figure near the church's side entrance. Charlotte sat in her wheelchair in the shade of an old oak tree, apparently waiting for the service to conclude. She was reading a small leather-bound book, her posture suggesting the kind of patient contentment that comes from being comfortable with one's own company. Elias approached with the careful steps of a man who was not entirely sure of his welcome. "Miss Hale," he said when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. "I hope I'm not intruding." Charlotte looked up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Mr. Boone, not at all. I was just enjoying the morning air while waiting for the congregation to finish their devotions. I find the service somewhat less taxing when experienced from outside the building." There was a hint of gentle humor in her voice that suggested this was a deliberate choice rather than an inability to participate fully in the community's religious life. Elias found himself curious about the distinction, but hesitant to probe what might be a sensitive topic. "I didn't expect to see you in town for so long," Charlotte continued. "I had the impression that mountain men made brief visits to civilization before returning to their preferred solitude." "Usually that's true," Elias admitted. "But I found myself with more business to attend to than I had anticipated." It was not entirely a lie, though the nature of the business he was reluctant to examine too closely. Charlotte's grey eyes studied his face with the same intelligent attention he remembered from their first meeting, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she saw through his careful neutrality to the uncertainty beneath. "I'm glad," she said simply. "I've been hoping we might have another opportunity to talk. I enjoyed our conversation the other evening more than I had expected to." The frank admission surprised him with its directness. In his limited experience with polite society, people rarely stated their preferences so clearly, particularly when those preferences involved someone as obviously unsuitable as a mountain hermit. Charlotte's honesty was both refreshing and slightly unsettling. cutting through the elaborate social protocols that typically govern such interactions. As did I, Elias replied, finding that honesty seemed to breed honesty. Though I confess I'm not entirely sure what we found to talk about that made the time pass so agreeably. Perhaps it was the absence of expectation, Charlotte suggested. When you meet someone accidentally, there's no predetermined script to follow. You can simply be yourself and see what develops. The observation struck him as remarkably perceptive, touching on something he had felt but not articulated. Most of his interactions with townspeople followed predictable patterns, polite but distant exchanges that maintained appropriate boundaries while accomplishing necessary business. The evening at the tavern had been different precisely because neither of them had approached it with specific goals or social obligations. "Are you attending the service?" Elias asked, gesturing toward the church, where the sound of congregational singing indicated that the morning's worship was nearing its conclusion. "In my own way," Charlotte replied. "I find that I can appreciate the spiritual elements more clearly when I'm not distracted by the social dynamics that tend to dominate indoor gatherings. People mean well, but their concern for my welfare often overshadows their attention to higher matters." Again, there was no bitterness in her voice, just the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had learned to navigate social complexities with grace and pragmatism. Elias found himself impressed by her ability to maintain her dignity while acknowledging realities that might have embittered someone with less inner strength. "I haven't attended services regularly for many years," he said. "Mountain living tends to create its own forms of worship. Sunrise over the peaks, the sound of wind through pine trees. The satisfaction of honest work accomplished in good weather. That sounds like a form of prayer," Charlotte observed. "Perhaps more authentic than what happens inside buildings designed to contain the divine." The church doors opened, releasing a stream of well-dressed congregants into the morning sunlight. Elias recognized several faces from his previous visits to town, merchants, ranchers, and their families, all participating in the weekly ritual that reinforced Cedar Ridge's sense of community and shared values. He also noticed the way several pairs of eyes turned toward Charlotte and himself, registering their conversation with the kind of curiosity that would undoubtedly fuel speculation over Sunday dinner tables throughout the town. Charlotte seemed unperturbed by the attention, maintaining her composure with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being observed. But Elias felt the familiar discomfort of being the subject of scrutiny, the weight of judgment that had driven him to seek solitude in the first place. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation elsewhere," he suggested quietly. "I suspect we're providing more entertainment than either of us intended." Charlotte followed his gaze toward the dispersing congregation and nodded with understanding. "There's a small park near the library that's usually quiet on Sunday afternoons. If you're not opposed to a short walk, we might find more privacy there." The suggestion was made with the kind of casual confidence that indicated she was accustomed to navigating the town's geography despite her wheelchair. Elias found himself curious about the practical aspects of her mobility, though he was careful not to let his interest become obvious scrutiny. "I'd welcome the opportunity to see more of Cedar Ridge," he said. "My visits are usually too brief for much exploration." As they made their way through the town's quiet Sunday streets, Elias became aware of how natural it felt to match his pace to Charlotte's measured progress. There was something comfortable about their shared silence, punctuated by occasional observations about the architecture or the way the morning light fell across the carefully maintained gardens that graced many of the town's finer homes. The small park Charlotte had mentioned proved to be a carefully designed space tucked between the library and the town's modest courthouse. Ancient oak trees provided natural shade over winding paths that had been laid out with obvious consideration for both beauty and accessibility. Benches positioned at regular intervals offered places to rest and contemplate, while flower beds maintained with evident care added color and fragrance to the peaceful setting. Charlotte navigated the pathways with practiced ease, leading them to a secluded bench near a small fountain where the sound of falling water created a natural privacy screen against casual eavesdropping. The spot commanded a pleasant view of the surrounding gardens while offering relative isolation from the town's main thoroughfares. "This is lovely," Elias observed as they settled into comfortable positions. "I wouldn't have expected such a thoughtful design in a frontier town." "My mother was responsible for much of the planning," Charlotte explained, her voice carrying the warmth that always accompanied mentions of her late parent. She believed that civilization required more than just commerce and industry, that beauty and contemplation were essential elements of any community worth building. "She sounds like a woman of considerable vision." "She was." Charlotte's fingers traced the arm of her wheelchair absently, a gesture that seemed to accompany memories she treasured. She used to say that a town's character could be measured by how it treated its most vulnerable members and whether it made space for quiet reflection amid the bustle of daily business. The philosophy struck Elias as both practical and profound, reflecting the kind of thoughtful consideration that had clearly shaped Charlotte's own approach to life's challenges. He found himself wishing he had known this woman who had raised such a remarkable daughter, though the wish carried with it a recognition of how different his own life might have been if he had encountered such wisdom during his younger, more troubled years. "Do you spend much time here?" he asked, gesturing toward the peaceful surroundings. "More than I used to," Charlotte admitted. "Since my father has been away on ranch business, I've discovered the pleasure of setting my own schedule rather than adhering to the careful routines that others have established for my welfare." There was something in her tone that suggested this newfound freedom was both welcome and slightly overwhelming, as though she was still learning to trust her own judgment about how to spend her time. Elias recognized the feeling from his own early years on the mountain, when the absence of external structure had forced him to create his own patterns of meaning and purpose. "Independence can be as challenging as it is liberating," he observed. "When you're responsible for your own choices, there's no one else to blame if they prove unwise." "Exactly." Charlotte's grey eyes lit with the recognition of shared understanding. "Though I'm beginning to suspect that the risks of making my own mistakes might be preferable to the safety of living according to other people's careful plans for my protection." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elegantly dressed woman who approached their bench with the determined stride of someone on a mission of social importance. Elias recognized her as Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, whose reputation for community involvement was matched only by her talent for gathering and distributing information about her neighbors' private affairs. "Charlotte, my dear," Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed, with the kind of enthusiastic concern that immediately put Elias on guard. "How wonderful to see you enjoying this beautiful afternoon. And you must be the gentleman I've heard mentioned in connection with our dear Charlotte." The woman's eyes took in Elias's simple clothes and mountain-weathered appearance with the rapid assessment of someone accustomed to categorizing people according to their social utility. Her smile remained fixed, but Elias could sense the calculations taking place behind her carefully maintained expression of neighborly interest. "Mrs. Abernathy," Charlotte responded with practiced politeness. "May I present Mr. Elias Boone? Mr. Boone, this is Mrs. Abernathy, one of Cedar Ridge's most dedicated community members." "Mr. Boone," Mrs. Abernathy repeated, extending her gloved hand with the careful grace that indicated breeding and expectation. "I understand you're visiting us from the mountains." "How exciting. We so rarely have the opportunity to meet gentlemen from the wilderness areas." The way she pronounced wilderness suggested something between fascination and distaste, as though she were describing an exotic but slightly dangerous foreign country. Elias accepted her hand briefly, offering the kind of polite acknowledgement that social convention required, while hoping the encounter would conclude quickly. "I'm surprised to find you out and about without your usual escort." "My dear," Mrs. Abernathy continued, turning her attention back to Charlotte with the kind of concerned inquiry that was designed to elicit information while expressing appropriate worry. With your father away on business, I would have thought you might prefer the safety of remaining close to home. I appreciate your concern, Charlotte replied, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone while conveying subtle steel underneath. But I find that I'm quite capable of managing my own activities, particularly on such a beautiful afternoon, in such peaceful surroundings. Mrs. Abernathy's expression suggested that she found this independence somewhat alarming, though she was too well-bred to express her disapproval directly. Instead, she turned her attention back to Elias with renewed interest. And how long will you be gracing our community with your presence, Mr. Boone? I'm sure our local merchants appreciate the business that visiting gentlemen provide. I haven't determined my departure date yet, Elias replied carefully. It depends on several factors, including the weather conditions for mountain travel. This response seemed to satisfy Mrs. Abernathy's immediate curiosity while providing enough vagueness to prevent further specific inquiries. But Elias could see that she was filing away every detail of their encounter for future reference and discussion, undoubtedly with other community members who shared her interest in monitoring the social dynamics of Cedar Ridge society. After several more minutes of the kind of polite conversation that revealed nothing while suggesting everything, Mrs. Abernathy took her leave with expressions of delight at having met Elias and renewed concern for Charlotte's welfare during her father's absence. Her departure left them alone again, but the peaceful atmosphere of their earlier conversation had been replaced by an awareness of the scrutiny their friendship was likely to attract. I apologize for that, Charlotte said quietly. Mrs. Abernathy means well, but her concern for community welfare tends to express itself through rather intensive interest in other people's private affairs. Small towns have long memories and curious neighbors, Elias observed. I suppose any unusual friendship is bound to attract attention. Is that what this is? Charlotte asked, turning to face him directly. A friendship? The question was asked without coquetry or calculation, just the straightforward curiosity that had characterized all their interactions. But it forced Elias to confront feelings he had been reluctant to examine too closely. I'd like it to be, he said after a moment's consideration, though I'm not sure I remember how to be a friend to anyone. It's been a long time since I tried. For me as well, Charlotte admitted. The accident changed many things, including my relationships with people I had considered close friends. I've learned to be cautious about trusting new connections. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the play of afternoon sunlight through the oak leaves and listening to the gentle splash of the fountain. The admission of mutual vulnerability had created a new level of intimacy between them, one that felt both promising and slightly dangerous. Tuesday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Charlotte's door. Dr. Whitfield arrived without advance notice, his usually composed demeanor suggesting the kind of urgency that made her heart quicken with apprehension. He was accompanied by a stranger, a tall, lean man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions with confidence. Charlotte, my dear, Dr. Whitfield said as Mrs. Patterson showed them into the front parlor, I hope you'll forgive the impromptu visit. I'd like you to meet Dr. Samuel Morrison from Denver. He's the specialist I mentioned in my letter. Dr. Morrison stepped forward with a professional smile that managed to convey both competence and compassion. Miss Hale, it's a pleasure to meet you. Dr. Whitfield has told me a great deal about your case, and I confess I'm quite interested in discussing the possibilities that new surgical techniques might offer. Charlotte felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied any discussion of her medical condition. She had grown comfortable with her limitations, had built a life that accommodated them with grace and purpose. The prospect of change, even positive change, threatened the careful equilibrium she had worked so hard to achieve. Please sit down, she said, gesturing to the chairs that faced her position near the window. I must admit that your letter came as something of a surprise. Dr. Whitfield, I had understood that my condition was permanent. So did we all, Dr. Whitfield replied, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man who had delivered both good news and bad news, often enough to understand the weight of either. But Dr. Morrison has developed techniques that weren't available 3 years ago. The field of spinal surgery has advanced considerably, particularly in cases like yours, where the injury was severe but not necessarily irreversible. Dr. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his manner suggesting both enthusiasm and caution. Miss Hale, I want to be completely honest with you about what we're discussing. The procedures I've developed offer genuine hope for restoration of some degree of mobility, but they also carry significant risks. The surgery itself is complex and demanding, and the recovery would require months of intensive rehabilitation. What degree of mobility? Charlotte asked, her voice carefully neutral. She had learned to protect herself from false hope while remaining open to genuine possibilities. In cases similar to yours, I've seen patients regain the ability to walk with assistance, Dr. Morrison explained. Not full restoration necessarily, but enough improvement to allow standing, limited walking with supportive devices, and significantly increased independence in daily activities. The words seemed to hang in the air, like a promise that was too large to fully comprehend. Charlotte had spent 3 years learning to define independence within the constraints of her wheelchair, discovering strengths and capabilities she had never known she possessed. The possibility of expanding those capabilities was both thrilling and terrifying. The surgery would need to be performed in Denver, Dr. Whitfield continued. Dr. Morrison has established a clinic there with the specialized equipment and trained staff that such procedures require. The initial operation would be followed by several weeks of hospital stay, then months of rehabilitation. And the risks? Charlotte asked, because she had learned that hope without honest assessment of dangers was merely wishful thinking. Dr. Morrison's expression grew more serious. Any spinal surgery carries the risk of further damage, potentially resulting in complete paralysis or other complications. In your case, the risk is relatively low, perhaps 10%, but it exists nonetheless. There's also the possibility that the surgery might provide no improvement while still requiring the full recovery period. Charlotte absorbed this information with the methodical approach she had developed for processing difficult decisions. The rational part of her mind began calculating probabilities and weighing potential outcomes, while another part struggled with emotions she was not prepared to examine. How soon would you need a decision? She asked. There's no immediate urgency, Dr. Morrison assured her. But if you decide to proceed, I would recommend scheduling the surgery for early spring. That would allow sufficient recovery time before next winter, and the timing would coincide with some research I'm conducting that might benefit your particular case. After the doctors departed, Charlotte found herself alone with thoughts that refused to arrange themselves into any coherent pattern. The possibility of walking again seemed both miraculous and unreal, like something from a fairy tale rather than a medical reality. But it was the implications beyond the physical that truly unsettled her. The life she had built since the accident was predicated on certain assumptions about her limitations and capabilities. Her relationship with her father, her role in the community, even her growing friendship with Elias, all of these had developed within the context of her disability. Change, even positive change, would require renegotiating every aspect of her existence. It was while wrestling with these thoughts that she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She needed to talk to Elias, not because she expected him to provide answers. The decision would ultimately be hers alone, but because she had discovered that his perspective offered a unique combination of honesty and understanding that helped her think more clearly about difficult questions. The problem was finding him. She knew he was staying at the boarding house, but calling on a gentleman there would create exactly the kind of social speculation that Mrs. Abernathy's visit had warned her to expect. The alternative was waiting until Thursday evening at the tavern, but the weight of her news made such a delay seem unbearable. The solution, when it occurred to her, was both simple and slightly scandalous. She would send him a message requesting a meeting, delivered through Mrs. Patterson's grandson, who worked part-time at the boarding house. The boy could carry a note without attracting the attention that a formal messenger might generate. The note she composed was brief and carefully worded. "Mr. Boone, I find myself in need of conversation with someone whose judgment I trust. Would you be willing to meet me at the park near the library this evening at 6 o'clock? I would consider it a great favor. C. Hale." As she sealed the envelope, Charlotte reflected on how much had changed in the space of a few days. A week ago, she would never have considered seeking advice from a virtual stranger, particularly one whose own life seemed as complicated as Elias's clearly was. But something about their conversations had convinced her that he possessed the kind of wisdom that comes not from formal education but from wrestling honestly with life's difficulties. The afternoon passed slowly. Each hour waited with anticipation and anxiety. Charlotte found herself unable to concentrate on her usual activities, her mind returning repeatedly to Dr. Morrison's words and their implications. The possibility of walking again was seductive, but it came wrapped in uncertainties that threatened the carefully constructed stability of her current life. When evening finally arrived, she made her way to the park with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The familiar pathways seemed different somehow, charged with the significance of the conversation she was about to have. As she approached the secluded bench where they had sat before, she saw Elias already waiting, his presence suggesting that her message had been received and understood. "Thank you for coming," she said, as she positioned her wheelchair facing the bench where he sat. "I wasn't sure the message would reach you, or that you would be willing to meet on such short notice." "Your note suggested that something important had happened," Elias replied, his weathered face reflecting genuine concern. "I hope you haven't received bad news." "Not bad news exactly," Charlotte said, then paused, uncertain how to begin explaining something she was still struggling to understand herself. "Complicated news. The kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your life." Elias waited with the patient stillness that had impressed her from their first meeting. His attention focused entirely on her words, without the restless energy that characterized most people's listening. It was this quality, his ability to be fully present without judgment or agenda, that had convinced her he might be the right person to help her think through her dilemma. "Do you remember the letter I mentioned, receiving from Dr. Whitfield?" she began. "The one about a specialist who might be able to help with my condition." Elias nodded, his expression growing more serious as he began to understand the direction of her story. "He came to see me today," Charlotte continued, "along with the specialist from Denver. They believe there might be a surgical procedure that could restore some degree of mobility. The possibility of walking again, with assistance." The words hung between them like a bridge across uncertain territory, carrying weight that neither of them was fully prepared to bear. Charlotte watched Elias's face as he absorbed the implications of what she had told him, seeing there the same mixture of hope and concern that she felt herself. Elias absorbed Charlotte's revelation in the kind of thoughtful silence that had become characteristic of their conversations. The evening air carried the first hint of autumn's deeper chill, and the fountain's gentle murmur seemed to emphasize the weight of the decision she faced. When he finally spoke, his words carried the measured consideration she had come to trust. "That's extraordinary news," he said carefully. "But I can see from your expression that you're not entirely certain how to feel about it." "No," Charlotte admitted, grateful for his ability to see beyond the obvious implications to the complexity beneath. "I should be overjoyed, shouldn't I? The possibility of walking again, of regaining independence, I thought was lost forever. But instead, I find myself questioning everything I've built since the accident. What specifically troubles you about the prospect?" The question was asked without pressure or judgment, simply an invitation to examine her own thoughts more clearly. Charlotte had discovered that Elias possessed the rare gift of asking the right questions rather than offering premature answers, a quality that made him an invaluable companion for wrestling with difficult decisions. "I suppose it's the uncertainty," she said after a moment's reflection. "I've spent 3 years learning to live with limitations, finding strength I didn't know I possessed, building a life that has meaning despite what I can't do. The surgery could change everything, or it could change nothing, while still requiring me to risk everything I've gained. And then there's the question of why," Elias observed quietly. "Exactly." Charlotte's voice carried relief at being understood so completely. "Would I be choosing surgery because it would genuinely improve my life, or because others expect me to pursue any possibility of being normal again? The distinction matters more than I initially realized." They sat in contemplative silence as the shadows lengthened around them. Charlotte found herself studying Elias's profile, noting the way the fading light emphasized the lines that 30 years of mountain living had etched around his eyes. There was something about his presence that encouraged honest self-examination, as though his own struggles with difficult choices had given him insight into the process of moral reasoning. "May I ask you something?" Charlotte said eventually. "Of course. You mentioned that you've been on the mountain for 30 years. What drove you there? What were you escaping from?" The question was more personal than any she had previously asked, crossing into territory that their friendship had not yet explored. But the gravity of her own situation seemed to justify a deeper level of honesty between them. Elias was quiet for so long that Charlotte began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that had been carefully guarded for decades. "My brother Thomas," he said simply. "We were working a mining claim together, high up on the mountain face. I was the older brother, supposedly the responsible one. But I made a judgment error about the stability of a rock face, and when it gave way—" He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "Thomas survived the fall, but his legs were crushed, permanently. He lived for 6 more years, but he was never the same. The guilt of that drove me to the mountains, and I've been carrying it ever since." The admission hung between them like a confession offered to the mountain wind. Charlotte felt the pieces of Elias's character fall into place, with the clarity that comes from understanding someone's defining experience. His careful attention to her independence, his respect for her dignity despite her disability, his instinctive understanding of the complex emotions surrounding physical limitation, all of it made sense now. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been an unbearable burden to carry alone." "It was the burden I felt I deserved," Elias replied. "Thomas forgave me eventually, but I never learned to forgive myself." "And is that why our friendship matters to you?" Charlotte asked, her insight cutting to the heart of something neither of them had previously acknowledged. "Because it offers some form of redemption for what happened to your brother?" The question was asked without accusation, but it forced Elias to confront motivations he had not fully examined. His initial impulse was to deny any such connection, but Charlotte's honesty demanded equal honesty in return. "Perhaps partly," he admitted. "But if that was all there was to it, any acquaintance with someone facing physical challenges would serve the same purpose. What makes our friendship different is you, your strength, your refusal to be defined by limitations, your willingness to see me as something other than a hermit who abandoned the world." "And what do you see when you look at me?" Charlotte asked. "A woman who has transformed adversity into wisdom, limitation into strength. Someone who has faced the worst that life can offer and emerged with her dignity and purpose intact." "That's not about your disability, Charlotte. That's about who you are." The conversation had reached a level of intimacy that surprised them both. In the space of a few minutes, they had moved from polite friendship to something deeper and more complex, acknowledging feelings that neither was entirely prepared to examine. "There's something else about the surgery that troubles me," Charlotte said, returning to the decision that had brought them together. It feels like a betrayal of everything I've learned about myself since the accident. As though I'm rejecting the person I've become in favor of trying to return to who I was before. Or, Elias suggested gently, it could be seen as the next stage of your journey rather than a rejection of the current one. You've proven that you can build a meaningful life despite limitations. Now you have the opportunity to explore what might be possible if some of those limitations were removed. But what if the surgery fails? What if I risk everything I've built for the possibility of something better and end up worse than before? Those are valid concerns, Elias acknowledged. But they're also the questions that face anyone who chooses to pursue significant change. The mountain taught me that safety and growth rarely coexist. Sometimes you have to risk what you have to discover what you might become. Is that advice you follow yourself? Charlotte asked, her grey eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Or is it easier to offer such wisdom than to live by it? The challenge was gentle but unmistakable, forcing Elias to confront his own contradictions. He had spent 30 years choosing safety over growth, isolation over the risks that came with human connection. Yet here he was, encouraging Charlotte to embrace the very kind of uncertainty he had spent decades avoiding. "You're right to call me on that," he said after a long pause. "I've been a coward for 30 years, choosing the safety of solitude over the possibility of making things worse through action. Meeting you has forced me to recognize that I've been existing rather than living. And what are you prepared to do about that recognition?" The question hung between them as the last light faded from the sky and the gas lamps along the park's pathways began to flicker to life. Charlotte's challenge was forcing Elias to confront not just his past choices, but his future intentions. Their conversation had become a mirror, in which both of them could see their own fears and possibilities reflected with uncomfortable clarity. "I don't know yet," Elias admitted. "But I'm beginning to understand that remaining on the mountain indefinitely isn't the refuge I once thought it was. It's become another kind of prison, one I built for myself out of guilt and fear. So we're both facing the question of whether to risk what we have for what we might become," Charlotte observed. It seemed so. They sat in the gathering darkness, each lost in private contemplation of decisions that would reshape their lives. The fountain continued its gentle murmur, and the night air carried the scents of autumn flowers and distant wood smoke. Around them, Cedar Ridge settled into its evening routines, unaware that in their small corner of the park, two people were wrestling with choices that would determine not just their individual futures, but the nature of the connection that had grown between them. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," Charlotte said as they prepared to part ways. "Dr. Morrison wants an answer within 2 weeks. If I decide to proceed with the surgery, it would be scheduled for early spring, which means several months in Denver for the operation and recovery. The implications of such an extended absence hung unspoken between them. If Charlotte chose the surgery, their developing friendship would be tested by separation at precisely the moment when it was beginning to deepen into something more significant. If she chose against it, she would be making that decision partly based on considerations that had nothing to do with her medical situation. "That's a complication I hadn't considered," Elias said quietly. "For me as well," Charlotte admitted. "A week ago, the prospect of spending months away from Cedar Ridge would have seemed manageable, even appealing. Now it feels like abandoning something precious just when I'm beginning to understand its value. Perhaps," Elias suggested, "the decision shouldn't be based on what you might be leaving behind, but on what you hope to gain, both from the surgery and from life in general. And what do you hope to gain from life, Elias?" The question was asked softly, but it carried the weight of everything they had not yet said to each other. Their friendship had reached a crossroads where honesty about their feelings could no longer be avoided, where the careful boundaries they had maintained were beginning to feel more like barriers than protection. "The courage to stop running from the past," Elias said finally. the wisdom to know the difference between solitude that heals and isolation that merely postpones living, and perhaps the chance to discover whether 30 years of mountain living have left me capable of caring about someone other than myself. The admission was more revealing than anything he had shared before, acknowledging not just his attraction to Charlotte, but his recognition that their relationship had become a test of his ability to re-engage with life. Charlotte received his words with the gravity they deserved, understanding that they represented a form of commitment even as they raised new questions about what the future might hold. The next morning brought news that would force both Charlotte and Elias to confront their feelings sooner than either had expected. Theodore Hale returned from the fence repairs with a grim expression and information that changed everything. The damage had been more extensive than initially assessed, requiring him to travel to the territorial capital to negotiate emergency grazing rights with government officials. He would be leaving within 2 days and would be gone for at least 3 weeks. "I've arranged for your Aunt Margaret to come stay with you," Theodore announced over breakfast, his tone brooking no argument. "This isn't a matter for discussion, Charlotte. I won't have you remaining alone in the house for such an extended period, particularly with winter approaching." Charlotte felt her carefully maintained independence crumbling with each word. Aunt Margaret was a well-meaning woman whose idea of appropriate behavior for an unmarried lady in a wheelchair involved constant supervision, endless needlework, and protection from any activity that might be considered remotely stimulating or dangerous. "Father, that's completely unnecessary," Charlotte protested. "I've managed perfectly well during your brief absence. Mrs. Patterson and the household staff provide more than adequate support." "Brief absence is one thing," Theodore replied firmly. 3 weeks is quite another matter entirely. The decision is made, Charlotte. Margaret will arrive tomorrow afternoon. The prospect of 3 weeks under her aunt's watchful eye felt like a prison sentence. Charlotte had grown accustomed to making her own choices about how to spend her time, whom to see, where to go. And Margaret's presence would effectively end her freedom to continue developing her friendship with Elias, particularly at such a crucial time when important decisions needed to be made. After breakfast, Charlotte made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. Instead of accepting her father's arrangements passively, she chose to act on her own behalf. She sent word to Elias requesting an urgent meeting, then spent the morning preparing for a conversation she had never imagined having. They met at the park again, but this time Charlotte's demeanor carried a different energy, not the thoughtful contemplation of their previous encounters, but the focused determination of someone who had reached a point of crisis that demanded decisive action. "My father is leaving for the territorial capital tomorrow," she began without preamble. "He'll be gone for 3 weeks, and he's arranged for my aunt to come supervise my activities during his absence." Elias understood immediately the implications of this development. "That would make it difficult to continue our conversations." "Impossible," Charlotte corrected. "Aunt Margaret considers any unescorted interaction with gentlemen to be inappropriate, regardless of the circumstances. She would view our friendship as highly improper and would take steps to prevent it." "I see." Elias studied her face, noting the intensity there that suggested she had not simply come to inform him of changed circumstances. "What do you intend to do about it?" "I want to ask you something that may seem presumptuous," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. "Would you consider taking me to see your cabin on the mountain? I know it's an unusual request, but I feel I need to understand the place that has shaped you so profoundly. And I need time away from other people's expectations to think clearly about the surgery decision." The request was so unexpected that Elias found himself momentarily speechless. In 30 years of mountain living, he had never brought another person to his cabin, had never considered sharing that deeply private space with anyone. The idea of Charlotte making such a journey, particularly given her physical limitations, seemed both impossible and strangely compelling. "Charlotte," he said carefully, Even if such a thing were possible, which I'm not certain it is, the social implications would be enormous. An unmarried woman traveling alone with a man to his mountain retreat in Cedar Ridge society. That would be considered scandalous beyond repair. I know, Charlotte replied quietly. But I've been thinking about what you said regarding growth and safety rarely coexisting. Perhaps it's time I stopped allowing other people's opinions to determine the boundaries of my life. The journey itself would be challenging, Elias continued, his mind already working through the practical obstacles. The trails are steep and difficult, designed for horseback travel rather than wheeled vehicles. I'm not certain how we could manage the logistics. I can ride, Charlotte said simply. Not well, and not for great distances, but I maintained enough strength in my core and arms to stay mounted for reasonable periods. I rode frequently before the accident, and I've continued limited riding as part of my physical therapy. Elias found himself genuinely considering the possibility for the first time. The idea of showing Charlotte his mountain sanctuary, of sharing with her the peace and perspective that the high country provided, held an appeal that surprised him with its intensity. But the risks, both practical and social, were enormous. Even if we could manage the journey, he said slowly, what would you tell your father when he returns? How would you explain such an absence? I would tell him the truth, Charlotte replied with a conviction that impressed him, that I needed time to think clearly about important decisions, and that I chose to spend that time with someone whose judgment I trust. He may not approve, but he would understand the reasoning. The weight of her proposal settled between them like a challenge that would define not only their relationship, but their individual courage to choose authenticity over safety. Charlotte was asking him to risk everything he had built over 30 years of careful isolation, while simultaneously risking her own reputation and social standing for the chance to understand him more completely. The silence that followed. Charlotte's proposal stretched between them like a bridge they were both afraid to cross. Elias found himself wrestling with emotions he had spent 30 years trying to suppress, the longing for genuine human connection warring with the fear of causing harm through his choices. The weight of his brother Thomas's accident pressed against his consciousness, reminding him of the consequences that could follow from a single moment of poor judgment. Charlotte, he said finally, his voice rough with conflict, I can't be responsible for putting you at risk. If something happened to you on that mountain, if you were injured because of my decisions, he stopped, unable to finish the thought that carried too much resonance with his past. But you wouldn't be responsible, Charlotte replied with quiet intensity. This would be my choice, made with full knowledge of the risks involved. I'm not asking you to protect me from consequences. I'm asking you to trust me to make my own decisions about what those consequences might be worth. Her words cut through his protective instincts to the deeper issue beneath. Elias realized that his reluctance stemmed not just from concern for her safety, but from his own fear of emotional vulnerability. Sharing his mountain refuge would mean exposing the most private parts of himself to someone whose judgment had become important to him. There's something else, Charlotte continued, apparently reading his internal struggle with the clarity that had characterized all their interactions. I've made my decision about the surgery. I'm going to decline Dr. Morrison's offer. Charlotte, no. The words escaped before Elias could consider them, surprising them both with their vehemence. You can't make that choice based on our friendship. The surgery could give you back mobility you've lost. You can't sacrifice that possibility for anyone else's sake. I'm not, Charlotte said firmly. I'm making the choice based on what I've learned about myself since the accident. The person I've become, the strength I've discovered, the life I've built, these aren't consolation prizes for what I lost. They're genuine achievements that I value. The surgery would mean starting over, risking everything I've gained for the possibility of returning to who I was before. But the chance to walk again would be wonderful if it succeeded, Charlotte interrupted. But I've realized that my definition of a successful life doesn't depend on whether I can walk. It depends on whether I can continue growing, learning, forming meaningful relationships with people who see me as complete rather than damaged. The admission carried a weight that forced Elias to examine his own assumptions about what constituted a life worth living. Charlotte's refusal to view her current circumstances as something to be escaped challenged his own long-held belief that his mountain exile was justified by past mistakes. "If that's truly your decision," he said slowly, "then perhaps we both need to stop allowing fear to determine our choices." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying yes," Elias replied, the words emerging with a clarity that surprised him. "Yes, I'll take you to the mountain. Yes, I'll share that part of my life with you. And yes, I'll trust that you're capable of making informed decisions about risks worth taking." Charlotte's face lit with a smile that transformed her features entirely, revealing a joy and anticipation that had been carefully controlled in all their previous interactions. For the first time since he had known her, she looked not like someone managing difficulties with grace, but like someone embracing possibilities with excitement. "Thank you," she said simply. But the words carried depths of meaning that went far beyond gratitude for a mountain excursion. They spent the remainder of their time together working through the practical details of their plan. Elias would arrange for a gentle horse suitable for Charlotte's needs, along with the equipment necessary for her to ride safely over mountain terrain. They would leave early the following morning, before Aunt Margaret's arrival, and would return in time for Theodore's expected homecoming. "There's one more thing I need to ask," Charlotte said, as they prepared to part. "When we're on the mountain, I want you to tell me about Thomas, about what really happened, and how it has shaped your life since. I feel that I can't truly understand you without knowing that story completely." The request was both fair and terrifying. Elias had never spoken in detail about his brother's accident to anyone, had never allowed himself to examine it fully in the presence of another person. But if he was going to trust Charlotte with his sanctuary, perhaps it was time to trust her with his deepest pain as well. "All right," he agreed. "But I want something from you in return. I want you to tell me what it was really like after your accident. Not the graceful adaptation that everyone sees, but the struggle underneath. The fear, the anger, the moments when you weren't sure you could continue." "Agreed," Charlotte said without hesitation. As they parted ways, both understood that they had committed to more than a mountain excursion. They had agreed to share their most vulnerable truths with each other, to risk the safety of their carefully maintained facades for the possibility of genuine intimacy. The mountain would witness not just Charlotte's first journey to Elias's refuge, but both of their first steps toward emotional honesty that could transform them permanently. The journey to Elias's mountain cabin became a pilgrimage of honesty that transformed both of them in ways they had not anticipated. As Charlotte's horse picked its careful way up the switchback trails, with Elias leading and constantly monitoring her comfort and safety, they shared the stories that had shaped their deepest fears and strongest convictions. Elias spoke of Thomas with a tenderness that 30 years of guilt had not diminished. How his younger brother had trusted his judgment completely. How the sound of falling rock still haunted his dreams. How watching Thomas struggle with bitterness and eventual acceptance had taught him both the weight of responsibility and the possibility of forgiveness. Charlotte listened without offering false comfort or easy absolution, understanding that some stories needed to be witnessed rather than resolved. In return, she revealed the private struggle behind her public grace, the months of rage and despair following her accident, the slow process of rebuilding identity when everything she had believed about herself had been shattered, the lonely work of finding strength in limitation rather than seeking escape from it. Her honesty was surgical in its precision, cutting away the protective myths they had both constructed about resilience and revealing the raw human effort underneath. The cabin, when they finally reached it, surprised Charlotte with its simple beauty. Built from logs that had weathered to silver gray, positioned to catch both morning light and evening sunset, surrounded by the kind of vast mountain silence that made human concerns feel both insignificant and perfectly important. It represented everything Elias had told her about finding peace through solitude. But as the days passed, Charlotte's presence transformed the space in ways that Elias had not expected. Her delight in small discoveries, the view from his kitchen window, the intricate patterns Frost made on the cabin's glass, the sound of wind through pine branches that sang differently at various times of day, reminded him of beauty he had stopped noticing. Her practical suggestions for improvements, offered without presumption but with genuine interest in his comfort, made him realize how much of his mountain life had been about endurance rather than enjoyment. They spent 3 days together in the kind of sustained companionship that revealed character more clearly than months of social interaction. Charlotte's strength proved to be not the brittle determination he had sometimes suspected, but something flexible and enduring, capable of bending without breaking. Elias's gentleness, which she had glimpsed in their earlier conversations, emerged fully in his attentiveness to her needs and his careful consideration of her comfort without ever treating her as fragile. On their final evening, as they sat watching sunset paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Charlotte made an observation that crystallized everything they had discovered about each other. "I understand now why you came here," she said quietly, "and I understand why you've stayed. But I also understand why it's time for you to leave." "Is it?" Elias asked, though her words resonated with a truth he had been reluctant to acknowledge. "You've done the work of grieving and healing that you came here to do," Charlotte continued. "Thomas would have wanted you to forgive yourself eventually. Staying on the mountain indefinitely isn't honoring his memory. It's refusing to live the life his sacrifice made possible." "And what kind of life would that be?" "One where you allow yourself to care about people again. One where you use what you've learned about strength and solitude to help others find their own peace. One where you trust that the judgment that failed you once might have been refined by 30 years of reflection into something worthy of trust again." The conversation continued deep into the night, exploring possibilities that neither had dared consider separately. By dawn, they had reached an understanding that felt both inevitable and miraculous. Elias would leave the mountain, not to abandon the wisdom he had gained there, but to find ways of sharing it with a world that desperately needed such perspective. Their return to Cedar Ridge coincided with Theodore Hale's arrival from the territorial capital, creating a convergence that required careful navigation. Charlotte's explanation of her absence, that she had needed time for reflection about important decisions and had chosen to spend it with someone whose judgment she trusted, met with the kind of paternal concern she had expected, but also with grudging respect for her honesty and independence. Theodore's interview with Elias, conducted in the library with the formal gravity that such situations demanded, revealed the older man's protective instincts, but also his recognition that his daughter had found something valuable in their friendship. When Elias spoke of his intentions to establish a small ranch in the valley, to build a life that honored both his need for solitude and his growing understanding of community, Theodore listened with the careful attention of a man evaluating not just a suitor's prospects, but his character. The conclusion they reached was both practical and symbolic. Elias would purchase land adjacent to the Hale property, close enough for continued friendship, but distant enough to maintain independence. Charlotte would help him design a home that accommodated both his mountain-trained self-sufficiency and his readiness to welcome others into his life. Together, they would build something that honored their individual journeys while creating space for shared growth. 6 months later, as spring transformed the valley into a canvas of green meadows and wildflower abundance, Charlotte sat in her wheelchair on the porch of Elias's new home, watching him work in the garden they had planned together. The house was smaller than the Hale mansion, but perfectly suited to its purpose, a place where solitude and companionship could coexist, where a man who had learned to live alone could practice the art of living with others. Dr. Morrison's letter, which still lay in Charlotte's correspondence file, had become not a missed opportunity, but a confirmation of wisdom already gained. She had chosen to build upon the strength she had discovered rather than risking it for the possibility of returning to who she had been before. The decision felt more correct with each passing day. The reservation card that had first brought them together remained tucked between the pages of Charlotte's favorite book, not as a memento of chance, but as a reminder that the most important meetings in life often come disguised as simple accidents, requiring only the courage to recognize their significance and the wisdom to honor what they offer. As evening approached and Elias joined her on the porch, their comfortable silence spoke of the deep contentment that comes from choosing authentic connection over careful safety, from building love on the foundation of genuine understanding rather than romantic illusion. They had each found in the other not rescue from their individual struggles, but companionship for the ongoing work of living fully despite life's inevitable limitations. The mountains still called to Elias on difficult days, and Charlotte still grieved sometimes for the mobility she had lost. But they had learned that healing comes not from escaping pain, but from finding meaning within it, not from returning to who you were before, but from embracing who you have become. In choosing each other, they had chosen to stop running from life's complexities and start building something worthy of the wisdom their struggles had taught them.